Some of these boards have a little bit of cup to them. It's not too bad, but it's still there. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is run them through the table saw rather than racing off to the jointer and try and flatten them out on that. I'm going to take a little bit of width off each side. The boards are 90 millimeters at the moment, but my finished width is roughly about 60 millimeters. So I do have some to come off anyway. By taking a little bit of width off each side, you're actually getting rid of a bit of that cupping. So there's less milling work to do. Okay, so I've got all the pieces for the frame. I'm actually making 3 frames, all the same size. So I've got my 12 pieces there. All 12 are not the same thickness. They are grouped into 4s. So each group of 4 is the same thickness. Although the frames are going to be exactly the same size, I wanted to do something just slightly different with each. So the first frame will probably just be standard mitre joints, joined together, probably biscuit jointed. The second frame, I think I might do splines, edge splines on the mitres. And on the third frame, I'm thinking of doing just a very thin inlay. So the way I'll do that is probably just run a single groove along the table saw, they'll make it 3 millimeters, and then run a very fine inlay in that groove. Okay, so I've let the glue dry now for a couple of hours. Next thing to do will be just to trim these off. So I'll use the bandsaw, get them pretty close to the surface, and then a real light pass through the thicknesser again to get them nice and flat. I'm going to cut the rebate in these pieces now, and what I've done is I've just looked at each piece and decided which is the face that I like the best, and that would be the face, obviously the front of the frame, and then I put a mark where I want the rebate, just so I don't get confused, because it is easy to forget. The rebate is 9 millimeters deep, and I've set my saw blade at 9 millimeters. I get that 9 millimeters from the different dimensions of all the layers. So you have 2 millimeters of glass and 2 millimeters of mat board, which is 4 millimeters. And I typically use a 3mm MDF backing board. So that's 7 millimeters. And then I've given myself just an extra 2 millimeters space to put in clips or nails or whatever I choose to hold that backing board in. And the width of the rebate is going to be 7 millimeters. For no particular reason, I just chose 7 millimeters. So what I've done is I've measured the width of my piece, subtracted 7 millimeters, and I've got my fence set at that. So I'll go ahead and cut those rebates. I'm choosing to use the table saw to cut the rebates and make 2 or 3 passes over the table saw blade. The only reason for that is, well, there's a couple of reasons. It's easier to set up than the router because it's here. So my table saw is always basically set up. And the second thing is, when you're working with this very old, very seasoned hardwood, the timber's so dry that the grain tends to become very brittle and splintery. And I think with the table saw, well, I'm pretty sure with the table saw, I'll get less tear out, if any at all, than I would if I used a straight bit on the router. Okay, so now it's time to cut the mitres on these pieces. I'm going to cut the mitre on one end of each of the 4 pieces first, and then what we'll do is take our final measurement for each piece, flip them over on the sled, and then cut that second mitre. To cut the second mitre on these pieces means I also have to cut them to their final length. And to work out the final length of your pieces, there's just a little bit of math involved, but it's not too difficult, and I'll run through it now. If you have a look at my little fantastic sketch here that I've got on my homemade whiteboard, just a quick tip. If you want to make a whiteboard, get yourself an old picture frame like I've got here. Still has the glass in it. I just put a white piece of paper or white cardboard behind the glass, and you've got yourself an instant whiteboard. And if you use a whiteboard marker, it works fantastic. Okay, so getting back to how we work out the lengths of our pieces. That inside dimension there, that's the size of my glass and my backing board, basically. So it's 577 wide by 392 high. Now, to get the final length of the pieces, we need to add the dimension of the 2 side pieces. Now, the way we do that is you take the side piece and you measure from the outside edge to the inside edge of the rebate. Now, if I measure those ones there, they're 52 millimeters. So what I need to do is add that measurement to each of those measurements and add it twice, because we have 2 pieces. So that's plus 52, plus 52, and just to leave ourselves a little bit of clearance room around the edge, usually add about 3 millimeters, which leaves you 1.5 millimeters either side. So if I add 3 millimeters and add that all up and come up with 684. So that means that the outside length of the longer pieces is 684 millimeters. And if I do the same measurement for the side piece, so add 52 to that, another 52 and a 3, and that'll give me 499, which means that the outside length of the side piece is 499. Okay, so I've marked all the pieces now. Those measurements we just talked about, I've marked them on the outside edge of these pieces, so that's the long edge. I used my marking knife because I wanted a very fine line. At the moment I don't have facility to put stop blocks on this mitre sled. That is something I'm going to think about and install later on, but because it is a zero clearance sled, I'm quite confident in just relying on lining up those lines with the edge of the slot in the sled. So we'll go with that, and I'll cut all these. I said earlier in the video that I wanted to do spline mitres on one of the frames. So this is it here. I don't have a spline miter jig, and I wasn't going to make one up because it would delay the video too much. So what I did, I just made up one of my 5-minute jigs. That piece of melamine there, that's an offcut from the zero clearance mitre sled that I made. And all I've done is I've screwed that there to this secondary piece of timber here that's sitting on top of my sled, and it's just clamped down there to the sled, and it's clamped so that the distance here puts that blade right at the center of the frame. Just drilled a hole in there with a Forstner bit so I can put a clamp on, and that's basically it. Okay, so I've got these 3 frames all glued together now, looking pretty good. Next step, or almost the next step, is just to give them a light sand and finish them off with a clear coat. But before I do that, I want to run the outside edge over the jointer. Now the reason for that is all these pieces were finished on the jointer on the inside edge, and it's quite smooth. But the outside edges were only finished on the table saw. And although they're pretty smooth, and you've got to struggle to see them, there are very faint saw marks along the edges of these. And it's going to be a lot easier for me just to run it over the jointer, do a really shallow cut. That is easier than trying to sand those marks out, because it does take a lot of effort to sand this old reclaimed hardwood. So I'll just quickly do that, and then we can get some clear coat on. I wanted to make the 3 frames different to each other. So one has the inlay on the front face, and the second one has the splined mitres. But now this one's looking quite a bit plain, so I'm going to add something to this one as well. What I've decided to do is I'm going to use 6mm dowels, and I'm going to drill them into the front face right on the mitre line there. And they'll only be set in about a 1/4 of an inch, so just for looks. And sand them flush with the surface. I think that'll just add a nice little feature. Nothing too out there, yeah, just something that makes it different from the others. Well, there you have it. 3 photo frames, all slightly different to each other. I'm really happy with the way they turned out. Those photo frames are going to be Christmas gifts, 1 each to my 3 boys actually.